If the owner of the most expensive restaurant in the city discovered that his staff treated humble customers with disdain, what would he do? This is the story of a billionaire who decided to test it firsthand, and what he uncovered was far worse than he ever imagined. Disguised as a homeless man, he stepped into his own establishment and faced humiliation, mockery, and systemic discrimination. But instead of walking away, he chose to expose the truth and transform his business from the ground up. Curious to know how it all unfolded? Let's dive into this powerful tale of justice, humility, and redemption. Edward Collins was the kind of man who seemed to have it all: wealth, influence, and a reputation as a self-made billionaire. Yet, even with all his success, a nagging question kept him awake at night. You see, Edward wasn't just running a restaurant empire. He believed he was building sanctuaries where anyone could enjoy a meal and feel valued. But whispers had reached him, rumors that in his own establishments, people were being judged not by their hearts, but by their wallets and appearances. It's funny how life works, isn't it? You can build something with the best intentions, only to discover it's taken on a life of its own. He couldn't shake the thought. Was his life's work betraying his values? Imagine pouring your soul into something, only to find it might be hurting the very people you wanted to uplift. Edward wasn't one to sit idly by. He knew that no amount of money could buy back integrity once it was lost. So, he made a decision most billionaires wouldn't dare to consider. He would step out of his ivory tower and see the truth for himself. But not as Edward Collins, the polished tycoon. No, he would become someone invisible, someone society often overlooks. With that plan in mind, Edward prepared for an experience that would change him forever. Stripping away his tailored suits and polished image, he donned ragged clothes and smeared grease on his hands to complete the disguise. Looking into the mirror before stepping out, he barely recognized himself. Today, he thought, I'm not Edward Collins. I'm just another man trying to survive, and with that heavy realization weighing on his heart, he stepped out into the world he thought he knew so well. Little did he realize, what awaited him was far worse than anything he had imagined. Edward, now unrecognizable in his ragged disguise, stepped into the bustling streets of Dublin. The man who once commanded boardrooms with a single glance now found himself blending into the shadows, invisible to the world. It's strange, isn't it? How quickly people judge you based on what you wear or how you look. As he approached one of his own restaurants, its grand facade gleaming under the sun, he felt a pang of pride mixed with unease. This was his creation, yet today, he wasn't walking in as its owner. He was just another face in the crowd, someone society often overlooks without a second thought. As Edward lingered near the entrance, pretending to catch his breath, he noticed something unsettling. Staff and customers alike cast quick, dismissive glances his way, some even whispering to each other before laughing under their breath. For the first time in years, Edward felt the sting of being judged by appearances alone. It was a humbling moment, one that made him question how often we fail to see the humanity in others simply because they don't fit our expectations. Gathering his courage, he stepped inside, bracing himself for what lay ahead. The atmosphere shifted the moment Edward crossed the threshold. Conversations hushed and eyes turned toward him, not with curiosity, but with disdain. The staff avoided him like an unwelcome guest at a party, while patrons whispered behind their hands. Edward felt an unfamiliar heaviness settle over him, a mix of humiliation and determination. He thought about all the people who faced this kind of treatment daily, not as an experiment, but as their reality. And yet, he pressed on, choosing to sit at a corner table where he could observe without drawing too much attention. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of what would become an eye-opening journey into the heart of his business. The moment Edward sat down, the weight of judgment pressed on him like a heavy fog. The staff avoided his table as though his presence was a stain on their pristine establishment. It's ironic, isn't it? How quickly people assume they know your worth based on nothing more than appearances. Edward watched as well-dressed patrons were greeted with warm smiles and impeccable service, while he and others who seemed out of place were treated like afterthoughts. It was a harsh reminder of how deeply ingrained these biases are, even in places meant to bring people together. When a waiter finally approached, it wasn't with the courtesy Edward had once believed was standard in his restaurants. The man's tone was clipped, his gaze never meeting Edward's eyes. "Our menu might not be for you," he said with a smirk, as if Edward's presence was some kind of joke. Edward calmly handed over a crumpled bill from his pocket, only to have it scrutinized like counterfeit currency. The humiliation stung, but he stayed composed. After all, this wasn't just about him, it was about exposing the truth behind the polished facade of his business. As Edward sat in that corner, observing the room, he noticed he wasn't alone in this treatment. An elderly woman in modest clothing struggled to get anyone's attention for a simple glass of water. Meanwhile, the tables around her buzzed with laughter and attentive service. It was clear this wasn't an isolated incident, but a culture of discrimination woven into the fabric of the establishment. Edward felt anger simmering beneath his calm exterior, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small in a place that should have welcomed them. Edward's resolve deepened as he decided to dig beneath the surface of what he had experienced. After enduring the humiliation and observing the blatant mistreatment of others, he slipped into the administrative offices under the guise of searching for a restroom. It's funny how people let their guard down when they think no one is watching, isn't it? What Edward found there was more than just negligence. It was a deliberate system designed to silence complaints and perpetuate discrimination. Emails, records, and even internal memos painted a grim picture. Complaints from humble customers were ignored, negative reviews were erased, and pricing irregularities targeted those who seemed less fortunate. As Edward sifted through the evidence, his heart sank. How could something he built with such care have gone so wrong? It's a sobering thought. How often do we trust others to uphold our values, only to discover they've been compromised in our absence? He couldn't help but think of all the people who had walked into his restaurants, hoping for a moment of comfort, and instead left feeling smaller than when they arrived. This wasn't just about bad service. It was about dignity, something no one should ever have to fight for. With proof in hand and anger simmering just below the surface, Edward knew what had to be done. But this wasn't just about firing a few bad apples or issuing an apology. No, this was about tearing down a culture of arrogance and rebuilding it from the ground up. As he left the office that day, his mind raced with plans not just for justice but for redemption. The next step would be bold, public, and unforgettable. The next morning, Edward returned to the restaurant, but this time, he wasn't the invisible man in rags. Dressed in his signature tailored suit, he strode through the doors with a commanding presence that froze the room. The same staff who had dismissed and mocked him the day before now scrambled to greet him, their smiles as forced as they were insincere. Isn't it strange how quickly people's attitudes shift when they think you're someone important? Edward didn't return their pleasantries. Instead, he walked to the center of the dining area, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "Yesterday, I was here, not as your boss, but as someone you judged by appearance. And what I saw was unacceptable." The room fell silent as Edward recounted every detail of his experience, the disdainful looks, the mocking laughter, the deliberate neglect. He didn't stop there. Producing the evidence he had uncovered in the office, he laid bare the systemic discrimination and unethical practices that had been festering under his nose. The The staff's faces turned pale as he revealed emails about ignored complaints and erased reviews. Customers watched in stunned silence, some visibly moved by his words. "This restaurant was built to be a place where everyone feels welcome," Edward declared. "But you turned it into a sanctuary for arrogance and prejudice. That ends today." With swift decisiveness, Edward announced the immediate dismissal of the managers involved in covering up complaints and perpetuating discriminatory practices. But he didn't stop there. He offered free meals to all humble customers present that day as a gesture of apology. His voice carried both authority and remorse as he promised sweeping changes: new staff training programs, transparent complaint channels, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. The room erupted into applause, not just from those who had been wronged, but from patrons who admired his courage to confront the truth head-on. Edward's actions didn't stop at the dramatic reveal. They were merely the spark for a much larger transformation. In the days that followed, he took swift and decisive steps to rebuild his restaurant's culture from the ground up. He brought in experts to train his staff, not just on customer service, but on empathy and respect. Isn't it amazing how much we can achieve when we focus on understanding others? He also implemented a transparent system for handling complaints, ensuring that every voice, no matter how small, would be heard. The restaurant wasn't just changing policies. It was rewriting its values. Word of Edward's bold actions spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with praise for the billionaire who had dared to step into someone else's shoes literally and confront the flaws in his own empire. People from all walks of life shared their own stories of being judged or dismissed based on appearances, creating a wave of solidarity that extended far beyond the walls of Edward's restaurant. It's funny how one act of accountability can inspire so many others to reflect on their own behavior, isn't it? The restaurant became a symbol, not just of fine dining, but of inclusion and respect, a place where everyone could feel valued. But Edward knew this wasn't just about fixing a business. It was about setting an example. He began speaking publicly about what he had learned, emphasizing that true success isn't measured by profits or prestige, but by how you treat others. Respect isn't something you earn by wearing a suit or driving a fancy car, he told an audience during an interview. It's something everyone deserves, simply because they're human. His words resonated deeply, sparking conversations around the world about judgment, privilege, and the power of humility. And as Edward continued to walk through his restaurants, not as a boss, but as someone willing to listen, he proved that change isn't just possible, it's necessary. Life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them, doesn't it? Edward's journey was more than just an eye-opening experience. It was a reminder that power and privilege come with responsibility. How often do we pause to reflect on the way we treat others? How often do we judge someone by their appearance, their clothes, or their circumstances rather than their character? Edward's story challenges us to confront these uncomfortable truths and ask ourselves, are we building a world where everyone feels valued, or are we unknowingly contributing to a culture of exclusion? This tale isn't just about a billionaire and his restaurant, it's about all of us. It's about how small acts of kindness can ripple outward, transforming not just businesses, but entire communities. Think about the last time you interacted with someone who seemed different from you. Did you see them for who they truly were, or did you let assumptions cloud your judgment? Stories like Edward's remind us that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in the respect and dignity we offer to others. After all, isn't that what makes life meaningful? So, what will you do differently after hearing this story? Will you take a moment to reflect on how you treat those around you? Will you challenge yourself to see beyond appearances and embrace empathy in your daily life? Let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear your reflections. And if this story moved you as much as it moved me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring tale. Together, let's keep learning, growing, and building a world where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve. Until next time,